Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm the host, along here with my co-host, Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Good to be with you, Todd.
Good to be with you, Carl. Good to see you through the means of technology, since we aren't in person. But, Carl, I'll take any minute I can get with you. I just, it's your attention that I crave.
It's sanctifying. It's sanctifying. It's likewise. Well, with Love Fest, I love being with you as well, Tom. Nothing makes me feel superior than spending time with yourselves.
Listen, I'm happy to help in any way, Carl.
Yeah.
When people talk to me about the podcast, and they'll ask me questions about you. And I mean, typically, a lot of times I'll just make stuff up and I'll, talk about you in ways that will give them a false picture of you. Lately, I've been telling people that you're actually from Wildwood, New Jersey, and that the whole accent is just a put on. And so
took me a long time to get the accent down.
Yeah.
Accent, yes.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Well, we have an interesting podcast today. Just a little bit of personal background on this podcast. Some years ago, I decided, it got a twofold interest. I was developing a Christology course for Grove City College. Thankfully, we now have a proper theologian, so Christology is taught by somebody who knows what they're talking about. And I was also wanting to preach a sermon on the Transfiguration. And I really struggled to find good Protestant literature on the Transfiguration. In fact, I dropped a note to Patrick Henry Reardon, an Orthodox priest I know, serves in the Chicago area. And because I'd been at a pastor's breakfast and I'd been chatting when I was a pastor, chatting to an Orthodox priest there. And I sort of asked him, what would be one of your big criticisms of Protestantism? And he said, you guys pay no attention to the Transfiguration.
Interesting.
And I got reflecting on it, and I thought, well, I want to rectify that. When I teach this Christology course and when I'm asked to preach, I want to have a sermon on the Transfiguration. Mm-hmm. I struggle to find good Protestant literature on it. Father Reardon sent me in the direction of an excellent collection of patristic sermons gathered together in the St. Vladimir Seminary Press, Light on the Mountain, wonderful set of sermons by the patristic fathers on it. But I was really struggling to find good, solid Protestant material. And it led me to think that maybe that Orthodox priest had been onto something that Protestants do neglect it. So I was absolutely thrilled a few months ago when I was doing some routine searches on Amazon to see what's being published, to see that there is a book that has now been published from a really solid conservative Protestant evangelical perspective on the Transfiguration. It has the imaginative title of The Transfiguration of Christ, an Exegetical and Theological Reading, and it's by the wonderful Patrick Schreiner. Patrick is Associate Professor of New Testament and Biblical Theology at Todd's old alma mater, Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. Patrick, wonderful to have you with us, and thanks so much for writing a Protestant book on the Transfiguration.
Thanks so much, Carl and Todd. Good to be with you guys. And you're exactly right. There isn't a lot from a Protestant perspective on this. When I started research on this book, I actually tell this story at the beginning, but I went to our library, which is a good library. It's not huge, but it's a good library on campus here in Kansas City. And there were so many books on the resurrection, so many books on the atonement, which are necessary, right? We're so thankful for those. But there was only 3 books on the Transfiguration that I could find. And the first book that I read on the Transfiguration was the same one you read, Carl, Light on the Mountain. Yeah. And honestly, that is the best book, by far better than my book. I would encourage everyone, begin with that book. I'm just trying to follow in that tradition of reading in that way. That is I remember I was speaking in some places in Washington State, and I was reading that at the house I was just blown away by their homilies on the Transfiguration. I thought they were excellent. And it really, I already had a contract at that point, but it really was the source of me starting to think about the Transfiguration a lot more.
And what do you think, Patrick? It's the cliches. Why did you write the book? I'm not going to ask you in quite that form. But what is it that Protestants miss when they neglect the Transfiguration? What is it that what riches does the Protestant tradition lack when it neglects this, in some ways, central moment of Christ's incarnate ministry, pre-resurrection ministry?
Yeah, there's so much you could say, because one of the things that became clear to me as studying it is it does seem to bring all of these diverse themes and the storyline and themes in systematic theology together, whether you're speaking about eschatology or anthropology or Christology, or it's all there. But maybe a few things more specifically. I think Protestants might have the tendency, and maybe this is not as much anymore, but might have the tendency to speak of the means to our salvation, the cross, more than the goal to our salvation. And I think the Transfiguration is giving us a picture of the beatific vision, as it's been called. It's giving us a picture of our glorified state. And so maybe we tend to read over it because we focus so much on the mechanism by which we are saved, rather than the goal of seeing God. That's what we're longing for. The other thing I think we miss is, one of the big parts of my book is trying to do a lot of good Christology work. Even though I'm trained as a biblical scholar, I don't claim to be a systematician. I really believed, as I stepped into this, that you can't interpret it well without having those kind of classical Christological categories to help us. So I think the Transfiguration, I think you have some scenes in Jesus's life where maybe it's speaking more towards his humanity or more towards his divinity. I think the Transfiguration is this unique event where the humanity and the deity of Christ come together, the ad extra, ad intra come together, where his humanity is transfigured or transformed, but his deity is also revealed. So this reality that we have the God-man in one subject, in one person, and both things are made evident at the same time, where it's not canceling his humanity, it's glorifying his humanity, but his deity is also revealed, and that's told through images of light and his face shining and so forth and so on. And so I think it's kind of the groundwork, I think, that we could do a lot of Christology. And it's great to hear that you used a sermon on the Transfiguration to speak about Christology, because there are so many riches here. And I think it keeps us from emphasizing one aspect at the expense of the other, which is always the danger in Christology. And so the other thing I would say we miss if we neglect the Transfiguration is there's been a big push in biblical studies to talk about the embodied nature of the new heavens and new earth. I'm very thankful for that. I think that's true, and we needed that. But the Transfiguration uniquely marries the heavenly and the earthly, and this coincides with what I said about Christology. But they must ascend this mountain, and something spiritual happens, but that spiritual reality is made known in the flesh. And so I think we have the tendency to pendulum swing from that kind of heavenly view of our eternal state or an embodied view, and the Transfiguration says it's both and. But the heavenly sources the earthly, and it glorifies the earthly. And so it has this regulating effect upon our reading. I could say much more, but those are a few things.
I was thinking probably 15 years ago, I was preaching through the Gospel of Luke, and I remember coming to the Transfiguration, and I had just a great time studying and preparing for that. And I remember, as far back as I guess it was about at least 15 years ago, thinking, why haven't I heard much about the Transfiguration in the past? I mean, I'd heard it mentioned, I'd heard it preached, and I remember, kind of making fun of Peter because he wants to, but in terms of it really being developed, I never really remember that. And I had such a great time preaching the Transfiguration. Now, fast forward, I'm right now going through the Gospel of John, and I wish the Transfiguration was in the Gospel of John, because I want to talk to John about that, because it would fit so well in his gospel account. Particularly, I mean, you make a really good case for the Transfiguration having a lot to do with the pre-existent glory of Christ, that it's not just about matters eschatological, but that we need to, and could that be one of the reasons why, for instance, the Orthodox emphasize it so well, because it's tied, that they see it tying to his incarnation and his pre-incarnation, whereas Protestants, up until I guess just recently, started thinking about that.
Yeah, I think that you're tracing the history well. I think the early church, we have so many homilies that Brian Daly collected in that book, The Light on the Mountain. And the reason they thought it was such an important event for them, because it was pointing to this divine ontology that Jesus possesses. And I think, you think about the language of the creeds, light from light, you think about Hebrews 1:3, the radiance of the glory of God. I think much of this language, this imagery, we should be appropriately nervous of Trinitarian metaphors, but all the fathers were okay with the light metaphor. They loved using that light metaphor, and I think it's stemming from the Transfiguration. I actually argue in my book that this is a Trinitarian scene, that the Spirit appears as a type of cloud. That's what all the patristic authors basically said to a T. But so they're using this to speak about divine ontology, and then the Orthodox tradition is doing that. And then you kind of enter into the modern era, and no longer are we speaking about divine ontology. We're speaking about Christ as a human, that's being challenged. And so one of the reasons why we're probably not speaking about a lot is because you go to the normal, even evangelical modern day commentaries, and all they talk about is his kind of future glorious man, which I think that's all there, but we haven't been reading it according to really, again, going back to kind of classical Trinitarian and Christological categories. And so I think we've neglected it for that reason. The other thing I'd say for Protestants is we're not probably as good as this at the symbolic and mysterious events. You have images here, and it's source kind of a view of icons maybe for the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And we get really nervous about that, but I actually think there's a ton here. We need to press into those images. You don't have to go towards icon veneration or anything like that, but it is an event that doesn't just have the words of Jesus, but it has, I even did a study, just thinking back on this, like there's not a lot of narratives about Jesus's face. It talks about his turning his face towards Jerusalem. It talks about him being hit on the face in his trial, but really there's not a lot about Jesus's face, which Protestants have taken that and said, let's be careful about images of Christ. I think appropriately so. But the Transfiguration, it talks about his face a lot. Obviously, I think it's tied to Moses. But there's something unique about this in terms of the image of Christ. It goes back to he is the true image of God. And so, I think we overlook this because we're probably not trained or tend to go to an event like this. Maybe the final thing I'd say is it certainly sits out of place in terms of the timeline. So you have like, it's almost like an actor has missed his cues, right? It's like the future is shown in the present, but then he just goes back to the present reality. And I think in terms of, we're so tied to biblical theology in the best sense, but I always ask people, if you did a 10-minute summary of Christ's life, I think most people wouldn't talk about the Transfiguration because it sits out of place. It just, we don't really know what to do with it. Like he goes up on this mountain, he shines, and then he goes back to being kind of normal Jesus. And we're like, what was that all about? Why did you do that? And Peter's also confused. So I think there's just a lot of confusion around the event. But man, if you start pressing into it, it's just filled with riches. And that's why the early church and the Eastern tradition have really pressed into this. Yeah.
And it's interesting also that, as I said, it's not recorded in John, but that's peculiar to me because John, you mentioned light earlier. Light is such a prominent theme in John's gospel, beginning in the prologue. And even in the prologue, he has that cryptic reference, we have seen his glory. And I remember when I was preaching that portion of the prologue, I made it clear to the congregation, I was speculating, but I said, I can't help but think that John is at least in part reflecting here on his experience, witnessing the unveiling of the eternal glory of the Son at the Transfiguration, and light plays this continuous theme throughout John's gospel, and I just can't help but think that he's and I think you point this out in your book, where in the synoptics where it's mentioned, there's a real unity in terms of all of the details, kind of that Matthew, Mark, and Luke get, and you know, I think they certainly took this very seriously.
That's
but
right.
don't you think, don't you think, Todd, that there's a possibility that John, if you think about John theologically, he doesn't need to record the transfiguration, because the whole gospel is, in a sense,
That's a good point.
God manifest in the flesh. If you think of
right.
you know, the light shining through the flesh, when I preached on it, I actually made the point, this isn't three gospels, which makes it very, very important. Why isn't it in John? And towards the end, I said, I think it may not be in John because he doesn't need it. You know,
He's preaching the transfiguration the whole time.
Yeah, theologically,
right.
Theologically, it has a very distinct function in the synoptics because it brings something that isn't there elsewhere.
That's a good point.
That's right.
I'm speculating, of course.
Johannine scholars have talked about, I like this phrase, that John transposes much of the synoptic material into a different refrain. And I think that's totally true, that you have a lot of the same themes. There's really one Jesus in four gospels. There's telling the same story, but John's certainly telling the story in a different way. And as you have pointed out, John 1:9, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. I think that's transfiguration themes, and it's just woven throughout. Even the beginning, he was the word, and the command in the transfiguration, the only imperative is listen to him. This is my word to you, not Moses and Elijah primarily, but the Son is my word to you. And so really, many Johannine scholars have said, really, the transfiguration is woven throughout the entire Gospel of John without giving a narrative to it, because as Carl said, it's almost like he doesn't need it. The whole time he's arguing he's pre-existent, that he was before time. And so he's taking these themes, and if we can use the imagery of like refracting them through a different lens. And so, but it is curious because John was on the mountain with Jesus, you know, and
I wonder if he found it,
tell the narrative.
Yeah. I wonder if he found it too sacred to write about, or too ineffable to even try to describe in words. Who knows? Because
Peter wrote about it in 2 Peter 1.
That's true.
That's, you know, 2 Peter 1, he speaks about it. Interestingly, he doesn't speak a lot about the image, but more of the prophetic word, because that fits his theme in 2 Peter 1 of people denying that the parousia, the return of Christ, is going to happen. And his argument there is in 2 Peter 1, no, I was on the mountain with him. He's returning. This is what he's going to look like. And then you look through the rest of the New Testament and you see the images of what Christ will look like when he returns. And it's transfiguration images, whether it's Revelation 1 or Revelation 19, or you think even when Jesus appears to Saul on the Damascus Road, it's a bright light that appears before. That's transfiguration narrative again. And so it's one of those scenes that a lot of things for me began to click in terms of the biblical storyline.
And when you think about how light is revealed as well, again, going back to the sermon I preached, I made the point that we typically don't see light. We see light as it interacts or reflects off material things. And to use the sort of Calvinist language of God accommodating himself, that idea that when the light shines through the flesh, we actually see the invisible there in a mysterious way.
That's right.
There's something, I mean, you alluded earlier on to the beatific vision, Patrick. I think there's something truly revelatory. You know, the light of God in its purity is unbearable to us. But here we have it use the language of refracting. It's refracted through the flesh in a form that we are able to see. It would have been unbelievably glorious and overpowering.
That's right. Yeah, First Timothy, Paul speaks about God dwells in unapproachable light. And I kept on thinking about that theme. And so the light is both revelatory, but it's also blinding. And that's why you also have a cloud, because a cloud brings you into kind of this presence, but the cloud also conceals. And so I think we usually think of the transfiguration scene. This is where actually the Eastern tradition was helpful for me in reading them, but they definitely emphasize the apophatic theology more and the concealment of God, and that we can't truly see him. And I wouldn't follow them on everything, but I think for Protestants and Westerners to have that kind of cataphatic and revelation, and ultimately we still affirm that he dwells in unapproachable light, and that we must ultimately be transformed, I would argue, to see him. But that we also, as I think Westerners rightly emphasize, we see God in the face of Jesus Christ,
Right.
and the Son has truly revealed him. And this is what Moses longed to see from Exodus 33. He said, Yahweh, let me see your face. And Yahweh said no. And now Moses is on the mountain and he gets to see the face of Yahweh through the person of Jesus Christ. And so I think for both Elijah and Moses, those moments, if you go back to 1 Kings as well, those moments where they long to see God, it's finally fulfilled. And only Luke tells us they're talking about the Exodus, but I think everything's clicking into place for them now, right? They understand, the Exodus that I brought Israel through is now coming to completion. This Christ figure who's going to bring them on the new Exodus. But I think it's the moment where Moses sees God in the person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
That's good.
Of course, the language of Exodus is used in the Greek there.
That's right. Yeah, it is.
That's right.
It's actually the language. Yeah, in English,
Talking
it's usually
about his
departure.
Exodus.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Which makes sense because we're in right now when we're recording, we're in Holy Week, and I think a lot of people have asked me, like, how does this relate to the cross? But if you look at the context of the synoptics, it's Peter has confessed that Jesus is the Messiah. Then Jesus has told them, I must suffer, I must die, and then I'll be raised from the dead. And Peter is so upset, like usual, about this. And this scene is a picture to say, well, death is not the end of this story. So ultimately, he's saying suffering must come before glory. And what ultimately happens is the cross is transfigured, which is why we have them in our churches. Mm-hmm. The cross as a symbol is transfigured from an image of death into an image of life, because life will only come through death, which is why Jesus says, you must take up your cross and follow me. So really, the transfiguration, one author talked about it as a microcosm of the gospel. And I thought, what do you mean by that? At first I didn't see what that author saw, but then when I thought about the themes from suffering to glory, then I was like, oh, it is a microcosm of the gospel. This is a picture. This is the entryway really into Jesus's ministry into Jerusalem, and it fronts Jesus's glory to give the disciples hope. Now, they're not going to understand that in the moment. They will understand that after the resurrection. Oh, he was giving us hope. Right. But for us, we read this and we say, oh, okay, the cross is not the end of this story.
Yeah, yeah. I was really, as I was reading through the book, there were several new things, more than just several new things that came to me, which I found so helpful. One of them was, you just mentioned the transfiguration as microcosm of the gospel, and I remember when I was preaching through the prologue of John and those themes of light already coming through, I thought, the transfiguration shaped these men in really deep and profound ways. Again, we mentioned Peter, including it in one of his epistles, and it was this gracious act of God, of the Lord, preparing them for the horror that was going to come to sustain them. It is sadly a subject that is neglected because there is great wealth in it. And I would just say to our listeners, we commend this book to you, The Transfiguration of Christ, an Exegetical and Theological Reading by Patrick Schreiner. You can go to our website and enter to win a copy of this. It's published by Baker Academic, and it's very much worth your read if you are studying the subject, if you're studying the Gospels, if you're teaching the Gospels, if you're preaching the Gospels, if you just want more knowledge of this marvelous event in the life and ministry of Christ. This would be a great volume for you to go to and work through and be encouraged by. So if you go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter to win a copy of this book. And I did want to ask you, Patrick, one more question. Well, two things here. First of all, to our listeners, if you're thinking about going into ministry and you're looking at seminaries and you absolutely refuse to be a Presbyterian, then I would encourage you to check out Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City.
You'd still encourage them to go into the ministry under those circumstances.
I would still say it's all right. But check out Midwestern Seminary. We have some friends there. We've had members of the faculty as guests on this program before. It's a great seminary. They've just been killing it there in Kansas City, and marvelous faculty, beautiful
and we have
campus.
The Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes and all those
You've
people.
You've got the Chiefs. I mean, I'm
and
all
Taylor
about
Swift
Chiefs
now.
Nation. Absolutely. It's a marvelous seminary. Get on their website, check it out. And then one question for Patrick: should you get any visitors to Kansas City? And this is going to be a hard question, but where must they absolutely get barbecue while they're there?
That's a great question. There's a lot of debate here, like any city. I would recommend going to Joe's, Q39, and Jack Stack would be the first three that I would visit, and they're all good in their own way. Jack Stack is great at sides. Joe's is really good at everything, and then Q39, their ribs are amazing. So
Q39 is
if you're getting hungry already, just fly to Kansas City. It's probably pretty cheap. We're right in the middle of the country, and come get some barbecue. Call me up.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll treat you.
Well, to
what
our
would
listeners,
you recommend? You were here, Todd.
Well,
what would you recommend?
Some of the places that were great when I was there aren't great anymore. But I've been back for a few visits. I do know Q39 is terrific.
Yeah.
And I would recommend Jack Stack as well. So, Carl, what about you? Oh, I forgot. You're from England. You just eat boiled meat.
I do Indian food.
I like Indian
barbecue.
Food.
Massively overrated as far as I'm concerned.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Mortification of Spin, and we will look forward to being with you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.